In the heart of rural Nebraska, where endless fields of corn stretch toward the horizon and the nearest neighbor might be miles away, Margaret Maggie Thompson had built a life of quiet faith and hard work. Her farm, passed down through 3 generations, sat like a small island of civilization in an ocean of golden grain. But on a cold October night in 2019, something would shatter the peace that had defined this place for decades. Maggie was no stranger to the night sky. As a woman of deep faith, she often found herself standing on her porch after evening prayers, gazing up at God's creation spread across the heavens. The stars had always been her companions during the long, solitary hours that came with farm life. But what she witnessed that October evening was unlike anything she had ever seen. The lights appeared without warning, hovering silently above her north pasture. They weren't the familiar red and white strobes of aircraft, nor the steady glow of satellites. These lights pulsed with an otherworldly rhythm, casting eerie shadows across the cornfield. 3 distinct orbs, each the size of a house, moved in perfect formation across her property before disappearing beyond the tree line. Maggie's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She had lived through 62 years without ever calling the authorities about anything more serious than a stolen mailbox. But something deep in her gut told her this was different. This was important. The Custer County Sheriff's Office received her call at 11:47 p.m. Deputy Martinez, who took the report, would later describe Maggie's voice as steady but urgent. She spoke with the clarity of someone who knew the difference between what was normal and what was not. She had seen something, and she needed someone to know about it. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel by clicking the icon in the bottom right corner of your screen. Now, let's get into the story. What Maggie didn't know was that her phone call had triggered a chain of events that would ultimately lead to her disappearance. In a small town where everyone knew everyone, word traveled fast. By morning, half the county had heard about Maggie Thompson's strange report. Some folks dismissed it as the ramblings of a lonely widow. Others whispered about government conspiracies and secret military operations. Detective James Harrison was assigned to follow up on the report. A methodical man with 20 years of experience in law enforcement, Harrison had seen his share of unusual cases. But there was something about Maggie Thompson that impressed him immediately. She was articulate, specific in her details, and completely sober when she made her report. During their first interview, Maggie sat across from Harrison in her kitchen, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The autumn sun streamed through windows that she had cleaned that very morning, casting long shadows across the worn wooden table where she had shared countless meals with her late husband. "Detective, I know how this sounds," she began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent sleepless nights questioning her own sanity. "But I've lived on this land for 34 years. I know every sound, every shadow, every light that belongs here. What I saw doesn't belong." Harrison made careful notes as Maggie described the incident in detail. The lights had appeared at approximately 11:15 p.m., moving from east to west across her property. They made no sound, left no trace, and disappeared as suddenly as they had arrived. She had tried to photograph them with her phone, but the images came out blurred and distorted. "Mrs. Thompson," Harrison said gently, "have you noticed anything else unusual lately? Any strangers in the area, unusual activity on neighboring properties?" Maggie's expression grew thoughtful. "Now that you mention it, there have been some trucks passing through at odd hours. Heavy vehicles, not the kind we usually see on these back roads. And Tom Bradley has been asking a lot of questions about my property boundaries lately." Tom Bradley was Maggie's nearest neighbor, a man who had moved to the area 5 years earlier and kept mostly to himself. Harrison made a note to speak with him. Over the following weeks, Maggie became increasingly convinced that she was being watched. She noticed tire tracks in her driveway that didn't match her own vehicle. Her dogs, usually calm and friendly, became agitated and would bark at empty fields, phone calls that went dead when she answered. Small things that, individually, might be explained away, but together painted a picture of surveillance. Maggie began documenting everything. She kept a detailed journal of unusual activities, took photographs of tire tracks and footprints, and even set up a simple security camera near her barn. She was determined to prove that something significant was happening on her property. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after her initial report. Maggie called Detective Harrison with excitement in her voice. She had captured something on her security camera, something that would change everything. "You need to see this, Detective," she said. "I've got them on tape." But Detective Harrison would never see that tape. The next morning, Maggie Thompson was gone. Her disappearance was discovered by Pastor David Mitchell, who had come to check on her after she missed Sunday service for the first time in 15 years. The front door was unlocked, coffee still warm in the pot, but Maggie was nowhere to be found. Her truck sat in the driveway, keys still hanging on the hook by the door. The security camera had been destroyed, its memory card missing. The journal Maggie had been keeping was never found. It was as if someone had carefully erased every trace of her investigation, leaving behind only questions and the haunting echo of her last phone call. Chapter 2. The search begins. The search for Margaret Thompson began within hours of Pastor Mitchell's frantic call to 911. Custer County hadn't seen anything like it in decades. Volunteers poured in from neighboring communities, their trucks forming long convoys along the country roads that led to the Thompson farm. The local volunteer fire department set up a command center in the parking lot of Grace Methodist Church, where Maggie had been a faithful member for over 3 decades. Detective Harrison coordinated the initial search efforts with the state police and local volunteers. The Nebraska State Patrol brought in search dogs, helicopters, and specialized equipment designed to find missing persons in rural areas. For 72 hours, teams combed through cornfields, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings within a 20-mile radius of the Thompson property. Serafina Thompson arrived from Omaha on the second day of the search. At 26, she was a nurse at Methodist Hospital, having inherited her mother's caring nature and practical approach to life. Sarah had spoken to her mother just 3 days before the disappearance, and nothing in their conversation had suggested any problems or concerns. "She sounded normal, Detective," Sarah told Harrison as they stood in her mother's kitchen, now transformed into an evidence processing area. "Mom was talking about winterizing the farm, mentioned she was thinking about getting a new roof on the barn. She seemed happy, maybe even excited about something, but she didn't say what." Harrison studied the young woman carefully. There was something in her mother's demeanor during their last conversation that Sarah couldn't quite articulate, but it nagged at her. Maggie had asked unusual questions about Sarah's life in the city, about whether she felt safe, whether she trusted the people around her. The search expanded to include interviews with everyone who had interacted with Maggie in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Tom Bradley, her nearest neighbor, seemed particularly nervous during his interview. A man in his late 30s with calloused hands and a guarded expression, Bradley claimed he had barely spoken to Maggie in months. "She kept to herself mostly," Bradley told Harrison. "Friendly enough when you'd run into her at the feed store, but we weren't what you'd call close neighbors. I heard about her calling in some kind of UFO sighting, but I figured it was just, well, you know how lonely people can get out here." Harrison pressed him about the property boundary questions Maggie had mentioned. Bradley's explanation was vague and unconvincing. He claimed he was thinking about expanding his own property and wanted to make sure he understood the survey lines correctly. Pastor David Mitchell provided a different perspective on Maggie's final weeks. A gentle man with gray temples and kind eyes, Pastor Mitchell had known the Thompson family for decades. He had officiated at Maggie's wedding, baptized Sarah, and delivered the eulogy at her husband's funeral 5 years earlier. Margaret was troubled about something, Pastor Mitchell told Harrison during their interview at the church. She came to me about 2 weeks before she disappeared, asking questions about faith and doubt, about what we should do when we witness something that others might not believe. The pastor's words carried weight in the small community. He described Maggie as one of the most level-headed people he had ever known, someone who weighed her words carefully and didn't speak without purpose. She asked me if I thought God would put someone in a position to see something important, something that might help others, Pastor Mitchell continued. I told her that God works through ordinary people all the time, that He gives us eyes to see what others might miss. I think I know what she was talking about now. The truth about Margaret Thompson's disappearance was more complex and disturbing than anyone had imagined, involving corruption at the highest levels of government and a conspiracy that reached far beyond a small farming community in Nebraska. Chapter 5. The Truth Revealed. October marked the 1-year anniversary of Margaret Thompson's disappearance, and the small farming community of Custer County prepared for another memorial service. But this year would be different. Detective Harrison, working with federal investigators who had not been compromised by the conspiracy, was ready to reveal the truth about what had happened to Maggie Thompson. The breakthrough had come when Professor Vasquez's cryptographic analysis led to the identification of Colonel Robert Hayes's location. The military officer had been transferred to a remote base in Alaska, effectively silencing him and removing him from the investigation. But Hayes had been waiting for an opportunity to tell his story, and when federal investigators approached him with evidence from Maggie's hidden archive, he was ready to cooperate. Hayes's testimony revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had cost Maggie Thompson her life. Meridian Aerospace had been conducting illegal testing of classified aircraft technology over private property in Nebraska and several other rural areas across the Midwest. The operations violated numerous federal laws, including restrictions on surveillance of American citizens and the use of private property without compensation or consent. The testing program had been approved by a small group of Pentagon officials who believed that the strategic importance of the technology justified the violation of civilian rights. When local residents began to notice the unusual aircraft, the decision was made to place informants in the communities to monitor potential security threats. Tom Bradley had been recruited by Meridian Aerospace through a network of former military personnel who were willing to serve as covert operatives in exchange for substantial compensation. Bradley's role was to integrate into the farming community and report on anyone who might witness or investigate the illegal operations. Margaret Thompson had become a priority target when her initial report to the sheriff's department demonstrated that she was an observant and persistent witness. The decision to monitor her activities more closely had led to the discovery that she was conducting her own investigation and building a comprehensive case against the illegal operations. The final decision to eliminate Maggie had been made when intercepted communications revealed that she was in contact with Colonel Hayes and was preparing to take her evidence to congressional oversight committees. The operation to silence her had been carried out by a private security firm contracted by Meridian Aerospace, specialists in making problems disappear without leaving traces. Detective Harrison's investigation, supported by federal authorities and armed with Maggie's hidden evidence, had finally pieced together the truth. But the most difficult part of the case remained: finding out what had happened to Margaret Thompson herself. The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Amanda Foster, a forensic anthropologist at the University of Nebraska, had been quietly analyzing soil samples from various locations around the Thompson farm. Working with Harrison and federal investigators, she had been searching for any trace of human remains that might indicate where Maggie had been buried. The breakthrough came when soil analysis revealed elevated levels of lime and other chemicals used to accelerate decomposition in a remote area of Tom Bradley's property. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the presence of disturbed Earth in a pattern consistent with a burial site. Bradley, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of federal charges for conspiracy and murder, finally agreed to cooperate with authorities. His confession revealed the final tragic details of Margaret Thompson's disappearance. On the night of October 15, 2019, a team of 3 operatives had entered Maggie's house while she slept. They had intended to stage her disappearance as a voluntary departure, making it appear that she had left to start a new life elsewhere. But Maggie had awakened during the operation and had fought back with the fierce determination that had defined her entire life. In the struggle that followed, Maggie had been killed. The operatives, panicked by the unplanned violence, had been forced to improvise a cover-up. They had destroyed the security camera, removed all evidence of Maggie's investigation from the house, and buried her body on Bradley's property under cover of darkness. The discovery of Margaret Thompson's remains brought a measure of closure to her family and community. But it also revealed the full horror of what had been done to silence a woman whose only crime was witnessing something she wasn't supposed to see. Sarah Thompson stood in the cemetery where her mother was finally laid to rest, surrounded by hundreds of community members who had come to pay their respects to a woman they now understood had died defending the rights of all Americans. Pastor David Mitchell delivered a eulogy that spoke to Maggie's courage and faith, her determination to stand up for what was right, even when it cost her everything. Margaret Thompson saw lights in the sky, but more importantly, she saw the light of truth, Pastor Mitchell said. She understood that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. Her courage reminds us that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they choose to stand up for what's right. The legal consequences of the conspiracy were severe. Multiple officials at Meridian Aerospace were convicted of federal crimes, including conspiracy to commit murder, violation of civil rights, and illegal surveillance. The Pentagon officials who had approved the illegal operations faced court-martial proceedings, and the entire classified testing program was terminated. Tom Bradley received a life sentence for his role in Margaret Thompson's murder, though his cooperation with authorities spared him the death penalty. In his final statement to the court, he expressed remorse for his actions and acknowledged that no amount of money had been worth the cost of an innocent woman's life. Colonel Robert Hayes, who had risked his career to expose the truth, was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. He retired from the military and became an advocate for government transparency and accountability, working to ensure that classified operations could never again violate civilian rights with impunity. Detective Harrison was promoted to chief of detectives, and his investigation of the Thompson case became a model for how local law enforcement could work with federal authorities to expose government corruption. He kept a photograph of Margaret Thompson on his desk as a reminder that every victim deserves justice, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against them. Sarah Thompson returned to her nursing career in Omaha, but she kept the family farm as a memorial to her mother's courage. She established the Margaret Thompson Foundation, which works to protect the rights of rural communities and ensure that government operations remain transparent and accountable to the people they serve. Lights that Margaret Thompson saw in the sky that October night had been the beginning of her final and most important investigation. Her determination to seek the truth, even in the face of mortal danger, had exposed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government and had reminded America that democracy depends on ordinary citizens who are willing to stand up for what's right. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the Nebraska wind whispers across the empty fields, the legacy of Margaret Thompson lives on. Her courage reminds us that the light of truth can never be permanently extinguished, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought by those who never intended to be soldiers. Her story serves as a testament to the power of faith, determination, and the unwavering belief that every person has the right to live free from fear and intimidation. Margaret Thompson's final investigation may have cost her life, but it also ensured that her community and communities across America would be safer for generations to come. The case of the missing farmer who reported lights in the sky became a landmark in the fight for government accountability and civilian rights. It stands as proof that even in the darkest moments, when powerful forces seem insurmountable, the truth has a way of emerging through the courage of ordinary people who refuse to remain silent. Margaret Thompson's light continues to shine, a beacon of hope for all who believe that justice and truth will ultimately prevail over corruption and conspiracy. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply refuse to look away when we witness something that isn't right. Reflection. The case of Margaret Thompson serves as a powerful reminder that courage comes in many forms, and that ordinary people can make extraordinary sacrifices in the pursuit of truth and justice. Her faith sustained her through the investigation that ultimately cost her life, but it also inspired others to continue the fight for accountability and transparency. In our own lives, we may not face conspiracies or government cover-ups, but we all encounter moments when we must choose between what is easy and what is right. Margaret's story challenges us to have the courage to speak up when we witness injustice, to support our communities in times of crisis, and to never forget that our individual actions can have profound consequences for the greater good. Her legacy reminds us to value the relationships we have with our families, our neighbors, and our communities. It encourages us to maintain our faith in the face of adversity and to trust that truth and justice will ultimately prevail, even when the path forward seems impossible. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about ordinary people who made extraordinary differences. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what other stories you'd like us to explore. Until next time, remember that every person has the potential to be a light in the darkness, just like Margaret Thompson. As the search entered its second week, physical evidence began to emerge. Tire tracks were found in a field about half a mile from Maggie's house, tracks that didn't match any of the vehicles used by the search teams. The tracks were deep and wide, suggesting a heavy vehicle had been parked there recently. More disturbing were the signs of disturbance around Maggie's property. Her neighbor's fence had been cut and hastily repaired. Fresh footprints were found near her barn, prints that belonged to at least 3 different people. Most telling of all, the ground around her destroyed security camera showed signs of a struggle. Someone was very interested in making sure that camera couldn't tell us what it saw, Harrison observed as he examined the scattered pieces of equipment. This wasn't random vandalism, this was professional. The investigation took on a more serious tone when the FBI became involved. Special Agent Rebecca Chun arrived from the Omaha field office with a team of federal investigators. Her presence suggested that Maggie's disappearance was being treated as more than a simple missing person case. Agent Chun was tight-lipped about the federal interest in the case, but she began asking questions about military installations in the area, defense contractors, and any unusual government activity. Her questions seemed to confirm what many in the community had begun to suspect. Maggie Thompson had stumbled onto something much bigger than strange lights in the sky. The search efforts gradually wound down as autumn turned to winter. The volunteers returned to their daily lives. The command center was dismantled, and the media attention faded. But Detective Harrison refused to let the case go cold. He continued to pursue leads, interview witnesses, and piece together the puzzle of what had happened to Margaret Thompson. During this time, Sarah Thompson made a decision that would prove crucial to the eventual resolution of her mother's case. She took a leave of absence from her job in Omaha and moved back to the family farm. Officially, she was there to maintain the property and keep her mother's affairs in order. Unofficially, she was conducting her own investigation. Sarah had inherited more than just her mother's practical nature. She had also inherited her stubborn determination and her unwillingness to accept easy answers. Living in the house where her mother had disappeared, sleeping in the bedroom where her mother had last laid her head, Sierra began to notice things that the official investigation had missed. Strange cars continued to pass by the property at odd hours. Her mother's mail was being tampered with, letters arriving days late with signs of having been opened and resealed. Most significantly, Sierra began to realize that someone was watching the farm, someone who wanted to know if Margaret Thompson's secrets had died with her. The winter months passed slowly, each day bringing new questions but few answers. The community gradually accepted that Margaret Thompson was gone, probably forever. Memorial services were held, tributes were published in the local newspaper, and life in rural Nebraska moved on. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the Nebraska wind howled across the empty fields, Sierra Thompson sat in her mother's kitchen and planned her own investigation. She was convinced that the answers to her mother's disappearance were hidden somewhere on the property, waiting for someone with the persistence and courage to find them. Chapter 3: Secrets in the Shadows. Spring arrived in Nebraska with its usual mix of promise and uncertainty. The fields that had been barren through the long winter began to show signs of new growth, and the search for Margaret Thompson entered its 7th month. Detective Harrison had been reassigned to other cases, though he continued to work on the Thompson disappearance during his off hours. The official investigation had stalled, but Harrison's personal commitment to finding the truth remained unwavering. Sierra Thompson had established a routine at the family farm that would have been familiar to her mother. She rose before dawn, tended to the animals that neighbors had helped her maintain through the winter, and spent her mornings walking the property boundaries. But unlike her mother, Sierra was searching for something specific, any trace of evidence that might explain what had happened on that October night. It was during one of these morning walks that Sierra made her first significant discovery. Near the tree line where her mother had last seen the mysterious lights, she found fragments of metal partially buried in the soft earth. The pieces were small, no larger than coins, but they had an unusual composition that didn't match anything she recognized from farm equipment. She carefully collected the fragments and took them to Professor Elena Vasquez at the University of Nebraska's Engineering Department. Professor Vasquez, who had known Sierra since her college days, agreed to analyze the metal samples discreetly. "These are interesting," Professor Vasquez told Sierra a week later. "The alloy composition is unusual. Not something you'd find in commercial applications. It's lightweight but incredibly strong, and there are trace elements that suggest advanced manufacturing techniques." The professor's analysis raised more questions than it answered. The metal fragments appeared to be from some kind of aircraft or specialized equipment, but nothing that would normally be found in rural Nebraska. Professor Vasquez promised to conduct more detailed tests, but she warned Sierra that getting definitive answers might take months. Meanwhile, Detective Harrison was pursuing his own line of investigation. The federal involvement in the case had always bothered him, particularly Agent Chun's questions about military installations. Harrison began researching defense contractors and government facilities in the region, looking for any connection to the strange lights. Maggie had reported that his breakthrough came through an unlikely source, a retired Air Force mechanic named Frank Morrison, who had moved to the area after his military service. Morrison approached Harrison at a local diner, claiming he had information about unusual aircraft activity in the weeks leading up to Maggie's disappearance. "I didn't want to get involved initially," Morrison explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I've been thinking about that woman's disappearance, and I think I might know something that could help." Morrison described seeing unusual aircraft flying low over the area on several occasions, always at night and always following flight patterns that didn't match commercial or military traffic. The aircraft were quiet, almost silent, and appeared to be conducting some kind of surveillance or testing operations, These weren't normal military exercises, Morrison insisted. I spent 20 years in the Air Force, and I know the difference between routine operations and something classified. What I saw looked like testing of experimental aircraft, probably some kind of stealth technology. Harrison pressed Morrison for more details, but the retired mechanic was reluctant to say more. He had already risked a great deal by coming forward, and he feared that drawing attention to classified military operations could have serious consequences. The connection between experimental aircraft and Maggie's disappearance became clearer when Harrison discovered that a defense contractor called Meridian Aerospace had been conducting classified testing in the region. Meridian specialized in advanced aircraft technology and had contracts with multiple government agencies for the development of surveillance and reconnaissance systems. Harrison's attempts to contact Meridian Aerospace were met with stonewalling and legal threats. Company representatives claimed they had no operations in Nebraska and threatened to pursue harassment charges if Harrison continued his inquiries. The response was so aggressive that it confirmed Harrison's suspicions that he was on the right track. Back at the farm, Sierra had been conducting her own investigation into the people who had been asking questions about her mother in the months before the disappearance. She discovered a pattern of inquiries that seemed designed to gather information about Maggie's daily routines, her social connections, and her level of involvement in community affairs. Tom Bradley, the neighbor who had seemed nervous during his police interview, had been particularly active in these inquiries. Sierra learned from other neighbors that Bradley had been asking detailed questions about Maggie's schedule, when she typically went to town, and whether she had any relatives who visited regularly. Sierra decided to approach Bradley directly, hoping to learn more about his interest in her mother. She found him working in his barn on a Saturday afternoon, repairing equipment with the focused intensity of someone trying to avoid conversation. "Mr. Bradley," Sierra called out as she approached. "I'm Sierra Thompson, Margaret's daughter. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about my mother." Bradley's reaction was immediate and telling. His face went pale, and he nearly dropped the wrench he was holding. For a moment, he seemed unable to speak, then recovered with an obvious effort. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said stiffly. "But I already told the police everything I know. Your mother and I weren't close neighbors." Sierra pressed him gently, asking about the property boundary questions he had mentioned to Detective Harrison. Bradley's explanation was even more vague and unconvincing than it had been with the police. He claimed he was no longer interested in expanding his property and seemed eager to end the conversation. As Sierra walked back to her mother's house, she noticed Bradley watching her from his barn window. There was something in his posture that suggested fear rather than curiosity. Whatever Tom Bradley knew about her mother's disappearance, he was terrified to talk about it. That evening, Sierra called Detective Harrison to share her observations about Bradley and the metal fragments Professor Vasquez was analyzing. Harrison was intrigued by both developments, particularly the neighbor's suspicious behavior. "I think it's time we took a harder look at Mr. Bradley," Harrison said. "If he's been asking questions about your mother's routines, he might have been gathering intelligence for someone else." Harrison began conducting surveillance on Bradley, watching his property and tracking his movements around town. What he discovered was disturbing. Bradley was in regular contact with people who had no apparent connection to farming or rural life. Men in expensive suits driving government vehicles visited Bradley's property at odd hours, always briefly, and always with an air of secrecy. The pattern suggested that Tom Bradley was not just a nervous neighbor. He was an informant, someone who had been placed in the community to monitor and report on activities that might threaten classified operations in the area. As spring turned to summer, the investigation began to take on the characteristics of a conspiracy much larger than anyone had initially imagined. Maggie Thompson hadn't just witnessed unusual lights in the sky. She had stumbled onto evidence of classified military operations that someone was willing to kill to protect. But the most shocking discoveries were yet to come, hidden in a place where Maggie had spent countless hours in prayer and contemplation, never knowing that her sanctuary would become the key to exposing the truth about her disappearance. Chapter 4. The Code in the Rafters. August brought oppressive heat to Nebraska, the kind that made work unbearable during the middle of the day, and forced farmers to rise before dawn to accomplish anything meaningful. Detective Harrison had been quietly building his case against Tom Bradley for months, gathering evidence of the man's suspicious contacts and unusual behavior. But it was Sarah Thompson who would make the discovery that would finally crack the case wide open. Sarah had been avoiding the barn since returning to the farm. The large wooden structure held too many memories of her father, who had spent countless hours there maintaining equipment and storing the harvest. But as she prepared to plant winter crops, she knew she couldn't put off dealing with the building's contents any longer. The barn was a testament to 3 generations of Thompson farming. Tools hung on walls where her grandfather had placed them decades earlier. Hay bales stacked to the rafters created a maze of shadows and hiding places. And everywhere, the accumulated dust and debris of years of agricultural life. Sarah began the overwhelming task of organizing and cataloging everything her mother had left behind. It was emotional work, made more difficult by the constant reminders of the life that had been suddenly and violently interrupted. But it was necessary work, and Sarah approached it with the same methodical determination that had defined her family for generations. She was clearing out a section near the back of the barn when she noticed something unusual. Several of the wooden support beams showed signs of recent disturbance, as if someone had been climbing or working in the rafters. Curious, Sarah borrowed a ladder from a neighbor and climbed up to investigate. What she found changed everything. Hidden in the space between the rafters and the roof, carefully wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture, was a metal box about the size of a shoebox. Inside the box, Sarah discovered her mother's missing journal, dozens of photographs, and most importantly, several sheets of paper covered with what appeared to be coded messages. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the journal and began to read her mother's final entries. The careful handwriting documented weeks of surveillance and investigation that went far beyond the simple sighting of unusual lights. Margaret Thompson had been conducting a sophisticated intelligence operation from her farm, methodically gathering evidence of classified military activities in the area. The journal entries painted a picture of a woman who had realized she was in danger but was determined to document the truth before it was too late. Maggie had identified the aircraft she had seen as experimental stealth technology being tested by Meridian Aerospace under classified government contracts. She had photographed the aircraft during subsequent visits and had even managed to record some of their communications. But most disturbing of all, Maggie had discovered that the testing operations were using her property and surrounding farmland without permission or compensation. The government contractors had been conducting low-level flights over private property, collecting data and testing surveillance equipment on American citizens without their knowledge or consent. The coded messages were the most intriguing discovery. Written in Maggie's careful handwriting, they appeared to be encrypted communications intended for someone who would understand their significance. Sarah recognized her mother's methodical approach in the way the messages were structured, but she couldn't decipher their meaning. Sarah immediately contacted Detective Harrison, who arrived at the farm within hours of her call. Together, they examined the contents of the hidden box, and Harrison's expression grew more serious with each new piece of evidence they uncovered. "Your mother wasn't just a witness," Harrison said grimly. "She was building a case. These photographs, this documentation, she was preparing to go public with evidence of illegal government operations." The photographs were particularly damning. They showed aircraft that didn't appear in any public records, vehicles with government plates parked on private property, and men in military uniforms conducting operations without legal authority. Maggie had been building a comprehensive dossier, that would have exposed the entire operation. Harrison called in Professor Elena Vasquez to help analyze the coded messages. The engineering professor had continued her analysis of the metal fragments and had developed a theory about their origin that connected directly to Maggie's discoveries. "The metal samples you found are definitely from advanced aircraft," Professor Vasquez explained to Sarah and Harrison. "They're consistent with materials used in classified stealth technology. Your mother was right about what she was seeing." The coded messages proved to be more challenging. Professor Vasquez enlisted the help of a colleague who specialized in cryptography, and together they began the painstaking process of breaking the encryption. The work was complicated by the fact that Maggie had created her own coding system, probably to ensure that only someone with specific knowledge could understand the messages. While the experts worked on decoding the messages, Harrison intensified his investigation of Tom Bradley and the other players in the conspiracy. Armed with Maggie's evidence, he was able to identify several government contractors and military personnel who had been involved in the illegal operations. The breakthrough came when Harrison discovered that Bradley had been recruited by Meridian Aerospace to serve as a local informant. The defense contractor had been concerned about potential witnesses to their testing operations and had placed Bradley in the area, specifically to monitor the local population and report on anyone who might pose a security threat. Bradley's reports to his handlers had identified Margaret Thompson as a potential problem weeks before her disappearance. Her initial call to the sheriff's department had triggered a security alert that led to intensive surveillance of her activities. When Maggie began her own investigation and started collecting evidence, the decision was made to eliminate the threat she posed. The coded messages finally yielded their secrets after weeks of painstaking analysis. Professor Vasquez's colleague had cracked Maggie's encryption system and revealed the true scope of her discoveries. The messages were communications between Maggie and a contact inside Meridian Aerospace, someone who had been secretly helping her gather evidence of the illegal operations. The inside contact was revealed to be Colonel Robert Hayes, a military officer who had become troubled by the violation of civilian rights and the illegal use of private property for classified operations. Hayes had been feeding information to Maggie through a secure communication system, helping her build a case that could be presented to congressional oversight committees. But Hayes had also been discovered by his superiors. His final message to Maggie, dated just days before her disappearance, warned her that their communication had been compromised and that she was in immediate danger. He urged her to hide the evidence and contact federal authorities outside the chain of command. That had been compromised by the conspiracy. The message was too late. Maggie had been taken before she could act on Hayes's warning, and the colonel himself had been transferred to a remote posting, where he could be monitored and silenced. With the coded messages deciphered and Maggie's evidence compiled, Detective Harrison finally had enough information to understand what had happened to Margaret Thompson. But understanding the crime and proving it in court were two different challenges, and the forces that had silenced Maggie were still active and dangerous.